Hello, my name is Steve Fletcher. I'm department head, the Americana department here at Skinner. And I have had the great pleasure of reading this book, Loud, Naked, and in Three Colors, The Liberty Boys and the History of Tattooing in Boston. What an unlikely subject matter. It was an unexpected pleasure. I like the intertwining of Boston history, talk about Scully Square, a place my father used to talk about. When he was a young man, it was the place where sailors went. He brought it up because when I joined the Navy, his parting words to me were, "Steve, just don't get a tattoo." Well, it's been a long time since that happened, but I think if I saw this book in a bookstore, I would immediately look at it because of the title. And who'd like to address where that came from? Let's start with that. Might we? You want to try that, Darren or Margaret?
I'll go ahead and take that.
Okay.
It's actually a quote from one of the Liberty sons. He was also a tattoo artist in Scully Square in Boston. And after World War II, they were quite pleased with the fact that they were making a great deal of money off of sailors and soldiers who were coming in wanting their tattoos removed because their girlfriends and their wives did not like them. And so Frank Liberty told a reporter that he knew, this was his quote, he knew when these guys were coming in and getting their tattoos loud, naked, and in three colors, that they would end up having to pay for it.
That's great. So in doing the research for this book, it seems like such an unlikely subject for a book in the first place. But when Darren said he was working on this project now, did you start with it about, did you say the beginning 6 years ago? Did you tell me that?
6 years ago.
So that, and you really stuck to it. So how did you find all this wealth of material? I mean, there's a lot in here, and I would think most of it was unknown to people.
It was. When we started, we didn't know if we would find anything at all. We were sort of told that not much survived from Boston related to tattooing, but we started tracking down descendants who would introduce us to other family members, befriending collectors, and as well as tattoo artists who have some of this material. And we just kept on chipping away at it, and more things started to surface until we felt like we had a really good sense of sort of the whole picture for what was happening with the Liberties and other tattoo artists working in Boston.
So I think it's interesting because it's a segment of, as small as it might have been, of popular culture in Boston. Do you think that tattooing, as far as the city of Boston goes, was perhaps a bigger business in Boston than in other cities? Boston, to me, seems like such a conservative town. Does that have nothing to do with it? I don't know.
Right. I mean, most cities had a tattoo scene. There were certainly, like Los Angeles, Norfolk, Virginia, Detroit, especially New York City. I would say there was a bigger tattoo scene there, but the one in Boston was very active. And by all accounts, the Liberty Men did very well, particularly during the war years. They made a good living at being tattoo artists.
And what percentage of their clients were women? Any thought on that?
A small number, but they did have women come in. I think they were very proud of the fact that they did tattoo ladies.
That's great. So I wonder what women's choices were. Would they have some muscle-bound guy on their arm, or?
No, posies and birds, I think, primarily.
Really? My
Yes.
goodness.
We do have sort of a record of this, because when people would come in to get tattoos removed, they would have to sign a consent form, and a big stack of these consent forms from the Liberties survive, and a lot of them are women clients, and so we know exactly what tattoo they were getting removed. They were usually small tattoos or initials or names, And we know the location of those tattoos and how much it costs to have them removed.
Was there, were they, the Liberty Boys, for example, somewhat concerned about their liability removing the tattoos, or?
I think they must have been. I mean, it's painful. My understanding is it's painful to get a tattoo removed today. So
Right.
100 years ago, it must have been terrifying. And we haven't documented any cases of blowback, but I'm sure they had many angry customers.
I would go ahead. Excuse me, Margaret.
The methods that they used for removal were left the person prone to infection. They had kind of homemade concoctions, these pastes of very caustic material that they would slather onto the tattoo, and then they would wrap it and leave it for an extended period. And it would essentially kill the skin, and it would scab over. So there was quite a risk of infection.
My goodness. So perhaps we should maybe concentrate on the flash art and talk about it. I like the phrase too. I'd never heard of it before I picked up this book.
Right. Yeah. So the hand painted tattoo designs that the tattoo artists would offer their clients are today they're referred to as flash art by collectors. But every tattoo shop worth its salt would be covered, sort of wall to wall with designs for people to choose from. And we have some great pictures to show in just a few minutes too. But fortunately for us, a lot of the artwork that the Liberty family owned survived, and we're actually able to match it with a lot of these old photographs. So we have a sense for who owned it and who painted it and when it was used.
So I would imagine, Margaret, the artistry involved in these designs varied considerably in quality. I guess we'll see shortly how we might rate the quality of the work that were done by the Liberty Boys. At the very least, it's very interesting. And a lot of it to me, and you probably could speak to this, it has a certain naive, I mean, it sounds a little silly, but a lot of it has a certain innocent quality, I think. There's something, some of them really quite sweet or sentimental. And I don't know whether that differs dramatically from what we see today. It would seem from my perspective that it does. But I would imagine that they were appealing to just popular taste and what people demanded. They would respond, I think, to customers. How often have they done something custom, if you will?
Darren, you want to take that?
Sure. Yeah. I think by and large the work was not custom. It
Right.
was. I think the phrase you hear in tattoo artists today is "pick 'em and stick 'em." You walk into the shop, point to the design you wanted, and they put it on you. There wasn't much room for discussion. And that is, has flipped 180 degrees today. I think it's largely custom work.
Well, the Liberty Boys, well, they weren't the easiest group of people to get along with, I've gathered. There was a lot of activity there, a lot of, well, what shall we call it?
Well, I think that they were. It depends on which Liberty you're talking about. They had a pretty good reputation among their colleagues, and certainly they're beloved by their family. There was one member of the family who was always bickering with the others, and I think he was a source of a lot of conflict, but also some of the most sort of colorful anecdotes come from this man. So it's good and bad, I suppose.
Yeah, I suppose with any family, it's going to be the same thing, right? And I might too, while I'm thinking about a comment on the design of this book, I think it's Rick Rollins designed the book, and I happen to know him. So when I saw his his name there, I went, hey, son of a gun, because it's a beautiful book. It's really great fun to look at. I think it's fascinating. It's the kind of book that if you put it on a table, people are compelled to pick it up. They just have to, don't you think?
He really did a beautiful job. He really enjoyed the artwork and pulling themes and colors and palettes and so forth from the designs that and the objects that that we included in the book.
So uh, the remaining designs that came from the Liberty brothers, do you think that is perhaps the bulk of what they did during their careers, or do you think a lot of it has disappeared? There seems to be a great deal in here.
Yeah, it's a lot survives, a lot more than I think anyone realized, and it was dispersed over time. So like we traveled all over the country literally to find these things, but
My goodness.
a lot doesn't survive, or we haven't found it yet, I should say, because we certain things we can document because of photographs, and there's a lot of material we've seen in early photos that we haven't been able to find in.
Has any material come to light as a result of the book being published that like they didn't think or know about it until, wait a minute,
A few
I've got
things,
something.
a couple of people have come forward with some artwork, which has been wonderful to see. But more than anything, what has happened is a lot of people have gotten in touch with us to share their memories of Scully Square or their memories of getting tattooed by the Liberties, because there's still a lot of Liberty family tattoos walking around. Just a week ago, a man from Argentina emailed me. He found out about the book. He emailed me to show us a picture of a clipper ship that he got tattooed on his forearm in the early 70s, at the very tail end of the last Liberty family, tattoo artist's career. So yeah, the response has been great. The information that has come in after the book was released has been great.
So is there a sequel?
There's certainly enough material for a sequel. I think this one took us 6 years to get out the door, so we'll see. I wouldn't say no, but we'll have to wait a while.
So you guys mentioned that there's been interest in this book from very far away places. Isn't that true?
Yes, we've sold around the world. We've sold in Iceland, in Australia, throughout Europe, throughout the United States, Canada. Where else, Darren? Have I pretty much hit the?
Yeah,
Go ahead.
For a while, we were keeping track of it because it was surprising. Tattoo history is a popular topic, particularly among tattoo artists, but this one is so focused on Boston that we thought the audience might be a little narrower, but that hasn't been the case. So hundreds of copies of the book have gone overseas to I certainly more than 50 countries at this point. And I think international sales, about a quarter of or a fifth of our sales have been overseas. So it's a surprise, a pleasant surprise.
Oh, I forgot Taiwan and Japan. We've also sold there.
Yeah.
So if we were to look at the designs, yeah, okay. The designs, do they vary from city to city particularly, or from country to country? Or they're sort of universal motifs that seem to travel across borders easily?
There is like a design vocabulary that exists in tattooing going back to certainly the early 19th century. Even there are records and descriptions and sometimes drawings of tattoos. So
right.
there is sort of standard designs that exist, and by the turn of the century, those designs really become standardized because of supply companies that pop up, including a big one in Boston. So yeah, if you were to go into a tattoo shop in Detroit or New York or anywhere else in the country, you're likely to see a lot of the same designs.
So I suppose rather than talking about them, it'd be kind of nice if we could see some, don't you think?
Yes.
Let's try that, shall we?
Let's jump in. So I will load this up here. Okay. This is a virtual book signing. So just sort of remind everyone that if you don't have a copy of the book, but if you like what you see here tonight and you want to buy a copy, head over to rakehouse.com. That's where you can buy it. And in the checkout, use the code Skinner, and that way we'll know to send you a signed copy of the book. So our story begins here. This is Scully Square. As many of you know, Scully Square doesn't exist anymore. It was torn down in the 60s under the guise of urban renewal. But for many decades, it was Boston's gritty, gaudy entertainment district. This is where the strip joints were, the dive bars, the burlesque theaters, and the tattoo shops and arcades. If you're playing hooky from school, this is where you went. If you're a sailor, you know, just a stone's throw away from the Navy shipyard in Charlestown, this is where you went to have a good time and to get into trouble. And from the 1910s, just after about World War I through 1962, which is when Massachusetts bans tattooing statewide, a man named Edward Liberty, he later went by the nickname Dad, and his three sons, Frank, Harold, and Ted, tattooed here. And they held basically a near monopoly on tattooing in the city during that time period. The stars that you see on the screen here, this is a photograph of Scully Square in 1948, sort of at the peak of Scully Square. And each of these stars represents the locations in this year of the different Liberty family shops. So you can see they really had, they literally had Scully Square cornered. There were some other tattoo artists who came and went during this time period, but none that really stuck around. The Liberties had sort of a stranglehold on what was happening there. And so, as we just talked about a moment ago, we're fortunate as historians and enthusiasts of tattoo history that so much of the Liberty family collection survives. It's this treasure trove of original hand-painted tattoo designs known as flash art, vernacular photography, graphic ephemera, shop furniture, really colorful trade signs. It's a little bit of everything. And that stuff got dispersed over time. And what Peggy and I have done over the last 6 or so years is basically go around and hunt down, we've hunted down all of these items and brought them back together for this book.
The Liberty story actually begins in Lowell, Massachusetts, though, which is a very large factory city outside one of the kind of the Boston suburbs or a Boston exurb. And Lowell had a lot of factories, particularly textile mills, and they were a great draw for French Canadian immigrants, particularly at the end of the 1800s and into the early 1900s. So the Liberty family immigrated from Canada and set themselves up in Lowell. And around the turn of the century, Lowell began to kind of fall on hard times. And the Liberties kind of started branching out a little bit and looking for entrepreneurial enterprises. And one of the things that they landed on was very low overhead entertainment venues, including little shooting galleries, and storefront shows where they would rent a vacant storefront for a very low price and bring in various small exotic animals and peep show scopes and the occasional tattoo person to display themselves and maybe a tattoo artist. And this is sort of how the Liberty family got their start and got their feet under them in the 20th century in Lowell.
That's right. So the shooting gallery target you see here is one from Edward Liberty's shooting gallery from about 1915. And the business card dates to just a few years later when he becomes a tattoo artist. And in the early years, he's pretty much unsettled. He's tattooing in Lowell, he's coming into Boston, he's tattooing in arcades, he's moving around from shop to shop. And a lot of tattoo artists at that time also tattooed on the road and carnivals and fairs and with sideshows. And that's what Ed Liberty did. And so this is really one of the great treasures of the Liberty family collection. This is an early photograph from about 1923. It shows, here I'm going to go to a detail. It shows Edward Liberty this is a promotional photograph of him doing cosmetic tattooing, allegedly applying blush to a woman's cheek. And the great thing about this photograph is that just sort of imposing wall of his original flash art, all framed up. And it would have been painted in very bright colors, so it would have caught your eye. Steve asked earlier if there are things that don't survive. The flash in this photograph is something that we have not been able to find. The resolution on this photograph is so high that we can actually zoom in and read the dates on the flash. So it's all dated 1921, 22, 23. A lot of it's signed by Edward Liberty, but we've yet to find any of these sheets. Hopefully they survive somewhere, and hopefully they'll turn up as a result of the work we've been doing. So this is one of the examples of original tattoo flash sheets that does survive from Ed Liberty's tattooing days in Boston. This dates to the early 1930s. It gives you sort of an example of, or some sense for like the tattoo designs that were available. They ranged from patriotic to religious to Japanese, and the letters that you see under each of the designs corresponded with a filing system for stencils. So a client would go into a shop, pick out a design, say a snake, letter L, and he would go to a filing cabinet or folder and pull out the corresponding stencil. He would then use some charcoal powder or some kind of powder to apply the pattern on the skin, and then would essentially trace it with a tattoo machine. And one of the really cool things about some of this flash that survives from his shop, and we know this stuff was in his shop because there are a bunch of photographs from the 1930s through the 1940s that show it hanging on the walls. But one of the really neat things is we believe his wife, Lena, may have painted some of this material. She was an amateur artist, and according to family history, she helped paint some of his tattoo flash. So whether he painted this one or she painted this one, it's not clear, but it's sort of neat to see that they had that kind of a partnership. And these are just two more sheets from Ed Liberty's tattoo shop. These are a little bit larger chest pieces. They would have been more expensive. The Libertys, by their own sort of admission, preferred to do small designs that they could really bang out. They weren't looking to do large, elaborate work, which was more time consuming.
And this is Ed Liberty's magnum opus. And when did he do this, Darren? Was it 1930?
Yeah, like 1930. It may have started in 1929, 1930, somewhere right in there.
Yep. And this man was named Cassius Church. He was an ex-Navy man, and he may have been considering a second career as a tattooed performer. And he got essentially a full bodysuit from Dad Liberty over the course of several months. And you can see actually on his chest there is one of those chest pieces, or very similar to one of the chest piece designs that we just saw on the previous slide. And the kind of fun thing about his back is that this image is a reproduction of a popular 19th century genre painting of the Madonna and Child. And Ed Liberty boasted that it had 37 angels in it.
And one of the interesting things about them as objects is that these are photo postcards. And what most tattoo artists would do who covered someone like this for exhibition is they would have them photographed, and they would produce these photo postcards that the tattoo artists would then sell, but also it was a way to promote their work. But the tattooed attractions, or these budding tattooed attractions, would sell them while they're out, exhibiting their bodies across the country, sort of further promoting the Liberty's work. So in the late 20s or early 20s, Ed's sons start to get into tattooing. And by 1930, they're starting to actually come into Boston, and they're working with him there. Prior to that, they're sort of working in Lowell. And so as a result of that, and one of the sons has the same name as him, there's two Edwards. And so to avoid confusion, he adopts the nickname Dad. And so from here on out, from the 1930s forward, he's just referred to as Dad. Dad Liberty, Dad's Tattoo Shop, Dad's Tattoo Studio. And you see this branding all over the sort of business cards, other trade paper and ephemera that they would hand out. And of course, these really colorful shop signs. We're lucky because a handful of their original signage, much like this, survived. And they needed them because the Liberties, for the most part, were tattooing out of these sort of low rent spaces that tended to be on the second or third floor of a building. Sometimes they were in the basement of a building. So they needed the signage to let people know where they were.
So this is Ed Liberty's oldest son. This is Frank. He is actually the one who we quoted in the title of the book. He's the one who came up with Loud, Naked, and in Three Colors. Darren, you want to talk a little bit about Frank?
Sure. So Frank, again, he starts tattooing in the 1920s in Lowell, but by 1930, late 1920s, Dad brings him into Boston where they're working side by side. He may have actually had a hand in tattooing that other guy that we just looked at a moment ago, but he works with Dad for like a year, and then he moves across the street or a few steps away and opens his own shop. The photograph on the left is from later in his career. This is a publicity still from a CBS radio show that he did, a popular Boston radio show. And the business card is earlier. That dates to about 1930, right when he opened his shop. And one of the sort of noteworthy things about the card is that it's very loudly advertising tattoos taken off, because the Liberties did do a brisk business in tattoo removal. And then the sheet that you see here is one of about a dozen that survive that we know Frank owned and used. We know that because there are photographs of them. There are photographs of him in his shop, and you can see some of these sheets in the background. And this is one of the sort of more interesting ones. It's a large chest piece or a belly piece, very patriotic. It's inspired by the Panama Pacific Exposition in 1915. I think I've got that correct. And so we think that this may have been Frank's sort of first set of tattoo flash, because some of the sheets, or one of the sheets anyway, is dated 1930, which is basically the year he opens his studio. And we don't know if he painted them. That's remained a mystery. It's possible. We sort of suspect that another Boston tattoo artist might have done it, but we'll just have to wait for more clues to trickle in before we can solve that puzzle.
And this is Ed Liberty's youngest son, who was also named Edward, but he went by the name Ted. And Ted was a troubled soul pretty much throughout his life. He did join Dad and Frank in Boston for a period of time, but he moved around a great deal, often because he was kind of like just ahead of the law. He was a petty criminal. The first thing that we know he did was he stole a car that belonged to a prominent Boston physician, and he joyrode it down to Delaware and abandoned it. He worked for a while in Maine, in Portland, and while he was there, he attempted robbery on a store that was just a couple of storefronts down from him. And of course, he was caught and spent 2 years in the Thomaston State Prison. So, Gary, you want to say some more about Ted?
Yeah. So, as Peggy mentioned, Ted's always sort of moving. The other Liberty family members stayed put in Boston, but Ted was always on the move, usually evading or just trying to distance himself from some trouble that he had stirred up. The sign that's on the left here from Ted's tattoo studio dates to the early 1950s, and it was painted in Baltimore because he sort of tattooed there briefly for a few years during that period, and he hired a local store card painter, show card painter, and cartoonist to cook up some signage for his shop. And so that's where this sign came from. And eventually, you know, he moves on from there, makes his way to Canada at some point, and just enters into partnerships and sort of with other tattoo artists. And it's like one failed partnership after another. Something always goes wrong. And finally, he kind of settles down in Vancouver, and that's where that's the one place where he found some stability, and he tattooed there until the end of his career through the early 70s or mid 70s, I think.
And then the last son to join the family tattooing in Boston was Harold, or Lefty Liberty. And this was the middle son. And like most middle children, he was the most stable of the three boys. He was happily married. His children remember him and their lives, their childhoods very, very fondly. And Harold resisted joining the tattoo trade for quite a while. He had a very lucrative and very good job with General Motors in New York for quite a while, and he worked there through the war, building airplane engine bodies and other things like that. But at the end of the war, he kind of was fed up with General Motors, and he came back to the Boston area and joined the family. Even though the tattoo trade at that time, since the end of World War II, the tattoo trade was beginning to decline considerably. But Harold had his shop above the Tasty, which was kind of a very iconic landmark greasy spoon in Scully Square. And you can see the tattoo signs there for Lefty's shop above the Tasty.
And these photographs date to 1957. So that's just when things start to kind of unravel in Boston. They start changing the tattooing laws. I think the first one is in 50 or 57, 55 or 57, where they change the age. They raise the age. And then in 1962, they ban tattooing outright in Massachusetts. He hangs on to the bitter end. At the same time that that's happening, Scully Square has been basically taken over by eminent domain. The city is evicting all of its tenants, and he's forced out along with everyone else who worked in Scully Square. And so he packs up his stuff. He moves across state lines to Salem, New Hampshire, and finds a nice spot there and tattoos out of a porch, attached to a house that he was living at. And there are these journal entries. One of the great things is that for us is that his journal survives, and there are these wonderful journal entries where he comments on the state of business. And he really lamented the fact that he had to leave Boston and was worried that his customers were not going to find him in New Hampshire, but they did. And it took a little while, but before long he was making more money in New Hampshire than he made in Boston. And so he tattoos there until the early 1970s, and then he sort of hangs it up. But in the process, he starts this, sort of this new scene in Salem, New Hampshire, that blossoms and, still exists today. So that's kind of an overview of the Liberty family, their sort of place in Boston, tattoo history in general. And what we thought we would do next, I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. This is an example of one of Lefty's sheets. So as Peggy said just a moment ago, he left upstate New York in 1946, and that's when he started learning to tattoo from his dad in Scully Square. And so this is one of the sheets that he painted as part of his first set of tattoo flash during that time period. And this hung in his shop in Boston, and he also hung it in his shop in Salem, New Hampshire. So one of the thrills of this project has been just this working with this treasure trove of original material. Not all of the artwork was painted by the Liberties. There are many examples of original flash art that belonged to other tattoo artists or was painted by other tattoo artists. A lot of it is unsigned. A lot of it took some real searching to sort of come up with some answers. And we thought we would just show you a few highlights of the Liberty collection, but things by other tattoo artists. So what you see on the screen here is a small book of hand-painted designs. Sometimes today people call these travel books. Most tattoo artists during this period, this dates to about 1910, 1915, they would have had small books like this that were easily portable. They could travel with them. And this is one of the finer examples I've seen. It was painted by a man named Ben Corday, who was literally a giant in the tattoo world. He stood at almost 7 feet tall, and he did do some like screen work and film work and like theater work as a result of his unusual height. But he was also regarded by his peers as one of the premier flash painters of his era. So this little book of designs that Ed Liberty winds up owning really captures sort of the peak of Corday's early years in the tattoo business. And the designs, again, they range from patriotic to popular culture. So this is, of course, the champion boxer John Sullivan, who happened to be from Boston. And here are a couple of more designs, sort of this unusual, grotesque dagger going through sort of this devil head. And then on the right, Japanese inspired, like naturalistic, spider and spider web design.
One of the most interesting and wonderful things that ended up being part of the Liberty family collection is a group of material from Frank Howard, who was Boston's earliest, or one of Boston's earliest tattoo artists. And he was quite an amazing person. He was an incredible entrepreneur, an amazing showman. He and his wife, Annie, were fully they were fully tattooed. They probably did that they had that done in Chicago. And they traveled then with Barnum and Bailey's Greatest Show on Earth. And they traveled to Europe, basically performing as tattooed people. And when they came back from the road, Frank set up in Scully Square in a very large shop that was covered with signage. It's really quite an extraordinary place. And from there, he tattooed, and he also had a very, very profitable mail order business in tattoo supplies. And when Edward Liberty when he came back from the West Coast in the 1920s, he got back to Boston right after Frank Howard died. And he ended up taking over Frank Howard's shop space. And we think that what happened was that there was material that had been abandoned in Howard's shop that then at Liberty basically took possession of. And so we're extremely fortunate to have this very, very early Frank Howard tattoo material.
Yeah, because before the Liberties, Frank Howard was sort of the Boston tattooer, and he, commanded a real presence in the city. And so some of the things that survive and that were passed down through the Liberty collection include this is a pamphlet from Frank Howard's supply business. He had partnered with another tattoo artist named Ed Smith. This dates to 1905, 1910 also. And so the inside of this pamphlet is just a listing of all the things he would sell, both professional tattoo artists and amateur tattoo artists. So pigments, designs, design sheets and books, stencils, photographs, machines, hand instruments, basically everything that you would need to tattoo, including instructions, which I don't know how helpful they were. We have a copy of the instructions. They're about a paragraph long. So in addition to ephemera like that, there's this group of Frank Howard artwork that survives. This is one of the smaller examples. This probably was from a book originally, one of those travel books, but it's just sort of a classic Japanese demon head, I suppose you call it, signed by Frank Howard. And sometimes when you come across these early pieces, especially the ones painted in books, the tattoos will be varnished, which is the case here. I don't know if you can see it on your screen, but the painting is varnished. And that's because so many people were handling them with their hands. They wanted to, protect them. So the things that survive range from these very small designs to this, which is a massive, this is about 3 feet tall. This is a window shade that Frank Howard painted up. Again, same time period. This was probably part of the group of flash he painted when he set up his new shop in Boston in 1905. And crudely sort of inscribed in the banner of the eagle at the top there is Smith and Howard, which of course was the partnership he had formed with that tattoo artist, Ed Smith. And these window shades were not uncommon among tattoo artists during this time period and later, and probably earlier. They were a great way to utilize space, but also you could roll them up and travel with them pretty easily.
And you can see from the window shade on the left that Frank Howard was very, very influenced by Japanese tattoo art. A lot of naturalistic and very, very elaborate designs.
And in addition to those other pieces we just saw, Ed Liberty also ended up with another travel book. This one painted by Frank Howard. It's maybe 6 by 8 inches, something like that. And so here's just a couple of pages from the inside of the book. Really sort of classic, what people think of today as like traditional American tattoo design. To people familiar with American decorative arts and maritime arts, this stuff they'll have seen these images before. The design on the left is sort of Sailor's Farewell, which of course you see on early ceramics, popular prints and lithographs. I think I've even seen it on stamped brass drawer pulls from the 19th century, early in the 19th century. And but this image made its way into that sort of design vocabulary that really kind of took hold around the turn of the century in America and elsewhere. And I'll just start this one off, but this is we thought we'd end with like a mystery sheet. So there's a group of just incredible, really beautifully painted, brightly colored tattoo flash that survives through the Liberty family. It also looks like it's painted on window shade, dates to probably the early to mid 1930s. And when we first saw these, we weren't really sure to what to make of them, and we still don't really know. But after a little more digging, what we discovered was that this is associated with a tattoo artist named Frank Harrington, who signed his name to another sheet of tattoo flash, not in the Liberty family collection, but clearly by the same hand. So he was working in New York City at the time, but Frank Harrington is a Boston-born tattoo artist and watercolorist, and he certainly would have known the Liberty family. So we're guessing that maybe they acquired this artwork through him. We're not entirely sure, but one of the really interesting things is that when Norman Rockwell paints his now iconic cover of the Saturday Evening Post, the famous painting of the tattoo artist, which I think is in the Brooklyn Museum of Art, the original, I'm not sure. Rockwell got reference material from a New York City tattoo artist who gave him a bunch of flash art that he then took to a studio and pinned up to plywood boards. And we know this because he has photographs of the setup. And some of this, so-called Frank Harrington flash is hanging on the board that he was using as reference material. So again, we're not sure if Frank Harrington painted this stuff or not. It may have been a Bowery tattoo artist. Those pieces of the puzzle we haven't found yet, but it's really cool to see the intersection of tattooing and popular culture and popular art, even during that time period, during the 1940s. And I guess my sort of closing statement would just be that, we spent 6 years on this project, but I feel like we've covered a lot of ground, but we're still learning new things, wouldn't you say, Peggy?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, there's so much more to do.
Yeah, so we've got some building blocks in place now, but there's a lot more work to do, and more material is surfacing every day. So it's a project that will continue in some form for us, and hopefully other people can sort of build on it. But if you want to see more of this stuff, you should buy a copy of the book. Go to rakehouse.com and use the code Skinner in checkout, so we know to send you a signed copy. And Steve held up the book earlier, but it's really a lush publication. There's over 160 illustrations of this sort of hand-painted tattoo flash art, vernacular photography, really colorful signage, graphic ephemera, none of which has ever been published before. Some of it hasn't seen the light of day in a century, and we're really proud of it. So hope you enjoy it. Thank you.
Well, I think you should be proud of it. It's a very attractive, very interesting book. And I really do think that you two have done a splendid job compiling all this hitherto unknown information, and the whole design of the book and the inclusion of all those flash examples it's just terrific. And I do hope it's a big success for you, because it deserves to be.
Thank you, Steve.
Thank you.
So I'd like to thank you very, very much, both of you, for talking to us tonight. We really enjoyed it.
It was a real treat for us too. Thank you for hosting it.
So is this good?
So that was a great talk. We do have some time for some questions. There's been a great turnout, and we already have some pending. If people do have questions, feel free to click the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. But why don't we just start off with the ones that have already come in and see how far we get. So the first question that we have is, if the authors could speak to the different times in our history when tattooing goes into fashion and out of fashion.
That's a really great question. You know, what we know of tattooing in, you know, like the 1700s, the 18th century, tattooing was largely, we think, it was limited to, you know, the criminal element, sailors. You know, it was very much a subculture, and that sort of held. And you know, soldiers and sailors would get tattooed. That kind of held into the 19th century. And then a little bit later into the 19th century, maybe the second half of the 19th century, an element of popularity creeps in. One of the interesting things is that there are British military officers and members of noble families in Britain who begin a fad of getting tattooed and getting very elaborate, particularly Japanese tattoos. So that was kind of the first wave of, you know, popularity outside in the more mainstream culture. And then, you know, it maybe perhaps died down a little bit then. And then wartime, World War I came along, huge demand for tattoos because they're, you know, such a huge mobilization of both soldiers and sailors. So tattooing really took off then as well. And that was another opportunity for tattoo to enter the mainstream. And every time it comes into the mainstream, it maintains its status in the mainstream a little bit better than it did the last time. So there will be a little bit of an ebb and flow, but it will never go all the way back to being just within you know, a limited subculture. So the two world wars really fired up tattooing and brought it into the mainstream. After World War II, it faded a bit again with, you know, Cold War and kind of the conformism that revolved around Cold War concerns, and also the rise of the American middle class and middle class norms. But then again, in the 1970s and 80s, motorcycle biker culture embraced tattooing. The Hollywood scene embraced tattooing. In fact, Darren, you should probably talk a little bit about Lyle Tuttle here.
Oh, sure. Well, one of the sort of great supporters of the project was a tattoo artist named Lyle Tuttle, who sadly passed away a couple of years ago. But he's sort of the first celebrity tattoo artist. He tattooed in the 70s in San Francisco. He was in Rolling Stone magazine for tattooing, you know, Janis Joplin, Cher, the Allman Brothers, a host of other really famous musicians and just pop culture figures. But while he's doing that, he also is pioneering the collecting and studying of tattoo history. So it's because of Lyle that we have so much material that survives from Ted Liberty, because in the 70s, Lyle befriended Ted Liberty, and after Ted passed, he eventually acquired most of Ted Liberty's collection.
I should also mention, is just to fill in another part of the, you know, the process of popularization over a couple hundred years. As American cities began to really industrialize in the mid to late 19th century, we had many immigrants coming from all over the world and coming into the cities where they lived. And there was very little in the way of entertainment for them there. So there became a wave of popular culture venues and entertainment options kind of sprang up, including particularly dime museums and circuses and things like that. And tattooed performers, you know, people who were fully tattooed, they would display themselves, and this was considered entertainment. And also just the spectacle of tattooing was also an enormous draw. So a tattoo artist who was more than likely tattooed himself would have a subject who he would tattoo, and people would watch as that was being done.
Great. So we are almost out of time, but we have, you know, time for one more question. there are a few that touch on the same thing, and it really is, Darren and Peggy, how did you get into such a topic and an interest like this? And how did you connect with Steve to collaborate on this presentation for everyone?
Well, my interest in tattoo history is like a number of things, but when I was much younger, I was interested in like sideshow history and circus history, and I pursued other things professionally. And this is how Steve and I met, because my background is really in early American furniture and folk art and early just different craft traditions. And so I was doing that professionally, but sort of as a hobby, I had an interest in this other topic. And eventually, through a number of different influences, including a friend of mine who introduced me to this topic in graduate school, I just fell in love with tattoo history. It's like this, the tattooed performers were the one attraction that when they left the sideshow stage, like their work was just beginning, because they would go behind the stage and tattoo people to make money. And that's where they made the real money. So the stories are so fascinating. The history is still largely undocumented. And like as a researcher and historian, that's just exciting.
Very
And,
good. Very good. So again, thanks to all who participated and all of those of you who have looked at this fascinating hour or so. I thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.